Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Patsy Hicks, and I'm Director of Education here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. And on behalf of the museum, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Parallel Stories for this season of 2019. So Happy New Year to everyone. I also want to take a moment just to ask you, if you haven't already, to please turn off your cell phones. And also to invite you so that you can be thinking about this as you're in the middle of enjoying this conversation, that there will be even more hedonistic activity to follow, which is a reception for all of you afterwards, in addition to a book signing. But in order to come to those, you have to ask really good questions during the Q&A period. So keep that in mind. So thank you. Also for adjusting as people arrive a little bit late. As always, no one wants to sit in the middle, so there's always some form of compromise in anything that's worthwhile. So, listening is a long-cherished art. David Hockney called it a positive act. You have to put yourself out to do it. Hemingway said of it, most people never listen, nor do they observe. Faye, the protagonist of Rachel Cusk's convention-defying trilogy, Outline, Transit, and Kudos, might be seen as the consummate listener, taking on, as one reviewer wrote, a radical passivity. What to make of this? This afternoon, we are fortunate to have with us and to listen to acclaimed author of 9 novels, 3 nonfiction works, a play, and numerous shorter essays and memoirs, Rachel Cusk. Her novels have won and been shortlisted for numerous awards. She was named one of Granta's Best of Young British Novelists in 2003. Her version of Euripides' Medea was shortlisted for the Susan Blackburn Smith Award. Her trilogy has been called a literary tour de force by the Financial Times, a literary masterpiece by the Washington Post, and the New Yorker has credited her with transforming fiction and the form of the sentence itself. We are so very delighted that she is here for the month of January as part of our artist residency program. So welcome, Rachel. In conversation with her is her longtime friend and ours, fellow author of the award-winning The Marriage Artist and chairman of the University of California Riverside Creative Writing Program, Andrew Weiner. Welcome back, Andrew. Once again on this stage, Andrew takes on the role of confessor-interviewer in a discussion with Rachel that might include the aftermath of controversy, the redrawing of the boundaries of fiction, the detached despair of silent couples, social habits, or the assumptions we make about art, motherhood, marriage, language, and loyalty. Now, as we ready ourselves to listen, please join me in welcoming Rachel Cusk and Andrew Weiner.
Thank you, Patsy. Can you hear me in the back? It's on. You cannot? You can hear me up there? Okay, great. So it's, I don't think I ever told you, Rachel, how I first came to read you.
No, I don't know.
So it's funny because we've decanted so much to each other, but it's very appropriate to this conversation and to your work, actually. So in order to give my wife time to work on her novel, the only thing I could do to distract the children for 10 hours at a time was Disneyland. And And so I fell into the habit of taking my daughters to amusement parks almost every weekend or every other weekend. And in order to survive these kinds of environments and waiting in line so much, I would always have books with me. And so I brought Outline to Disneyland one time, and I hadn't opened it yet, and I was waiting in line in a ride called Splash Mountain, and it was a 2-hour wait for one ride down a kind of a water ride, and I began to read Outline, and I immediately understood that I was reading a very different kind of novel. An experience I hadn't had, since, I mean, I can think of different names, but The Penal Colony by Kafka, it was just it seemed like I was reading a very different form of a novel, and yet the relationship that it put me into with realism and with reality was quite different than any of the other formalist or formal experimenters, the modernists. And the more I read, the more I kind of felt like, the connection was just deep and strong. And so it was a few years later, I think, or maybe a year later, that we finally met. And it's been a privilege to know you and to be your friend all this time, and to be here on the stage with you. I thought we'd begin by asking Rachel to read a bit from one of the trilogy books to give a kind of a flavor and to kind of open the conversation. And I think you're going to read from Outline.
I am. Strangely, if we were going to have a Outline Disneyland ride, it could be this. Well, this is in fact Splash Mountain that I'm about to read.
Can I just say that the probably the best thing that you're reading your book did for me there was it provided sanity, and that's no, but it's funny. Yeah, it is funny, but I think the thing that I most kind of admire about your work, and I'm grateful to you for, and I'm not alone, is that your work provides sanity for the reader, and I mean that very, very seriously.
Me, I think,
and you, not you,
and me, yeah,
and you, yeah.
So it's a little bit difficult. Hello, and I'm sorry that I've spoiled the weather in Santa Barbara by coming here for a month. It's a little difficult. The form of these books makes it slightly hard to sort of read a distinct chunk because it's a very flowing, so I just have to sort of dip into it and hope that you'll understand. So this is in fact Splash Mountain. It's one of the big themes throughout the trilogy is divorce and change. So the sort of breaking up of institutionalized forms of living and the pain and beauty that is released by that breaking up. So Outline is set in Athens. So these are Greek people talking, but they're talking in English. And this is a friend of the narrator who's telling a story about the first time he took his children away for a weekend on his own after the divorce from his wife. And they're on a road. They take a wrong turning and it begins to rain, and they're going up a mountain. In all the drama of the rain, I must have taken a wrong turning, because instead of joining the motorway, the road became steeper and steeper, and narrower, and the hills more and more desolate, until I saw that we were in a veritable mountain range, with enormous dizzying drops to each side, and great wads of cloud around the peaks. The storm had caused herds of goats and mountain pigs to run madly over the mountainsides, and sometimes they came swarming across the road right in front of the car. And then, a little further on, the road was deluged from above by a river that had burst its banks, and the children screamed as the water poured through one of the windows that had been left slightly open. The The sky was so black by now that even though it was only late morning, it was as if night had fallen. But up ahead, through the rain, I suddenly saw a building where there were lights. Amazingly enough, it was a mountain inn just beside the road, and we pulled over straight away, jumping out of the car and running across to the entrance of the low stone building with our jackets over our heads and flinging open the door. It was a nice enough place, in fact, and we must have looked quite extraordinary to the people inside. The children covered in bleeding bites, all three of us unkempt and soaking wet. The main room was full of Girl Scouts, at least 30 of them, all wearing a uniform that consisted of a navy skirt and blouse, a navy beret and a knotted yellow tie. They were singing all together, a song in French, with one or two of them accompanying on small musical instruments. This bizarre scene seemed quite acceptable to me after the awful seaside town and the storm and the mad goats. And in fact, one of the things that happened to me on that holiday, and that I believe has not changed since, was that I began to feel for the first time that I was seeing what was really there, without asking myself whether or not I was expecting to see it. When I think back to the time before, and especially to the years of my marriage, it seems to me as though my wife and I looked at the world through a long lens of preconception, by which we held ourselves at some unbreachable distance from what was around us, a distance that constituted a kind of safety, but also created a space for illusion. We never, I think, discovered the true nature of the things we saw, any more than we were ever in danger of being affected by them. We peered at them as people at people and places, like people on a ship peer at the passing mainland. And should we have seen them in any kind of trouble, or they us, there would have been nothing whatever either one of us could have done about it. It may have been to say something of this sort that I suddenly felt an overpowering need to talk to my wife, and I asked the owner of the inn if she had a telephone I could use. In the telephone booth, I dialed the number of my wife's new apartment in Athens, and was surprised to hear a man answer the phone. When eventually I got Krista on the line, I told her everything about our predicament, said that we were lost somewhere in the mountains, that there was a terrible storm, that the children were frightened and covered in mosquito bites, and that I doubted my ability to cope in such a crisis. But instead of responding with sympathy and concern, she was absolutely silent. The silence was only a few seconds long, but in that period, while she failed to come in on time and to take up, as it were, her part in our lifelong duet, I understood completely and definitively that Krista and I were no longer married, and that the war we were embroiled in was not merely a bitter aversion of the same lifelong engagement, but was something far more evil, something that had destruction, annihilation, non-existence as its ambition. Most of all, it wanted silence. And this, I realised, was what my conversations with Krista were all leading towards, a silence that would, in the end, remain unbroken, though on this occasion she did break it. "I'm sure you'll manage somehow," was what she said, and shortly after, the conversation concluded.
Beautiful. There are three things I want to say to you, and I'm sure I'll forget the other two as soon as I mention one of them. But I'll pick one. I can't remember which essay it's in your new collection, your forthcoming collection. You write about silent couples sitting at tables, whom I actually witnessed when I visited you at the pub. When I first visited Rachel in the town she lives in, your house was under reconstruction, and so I had to stay in a pub. And in this pub, I hadn't, of course, read this essay yet. The first thing I noticed that morning were all these vacationing couples of kind of middle-aged and older, sitting very silently at the tables, and it was actually much more noticeable than usual. It was a disproportionate percentage of silent couples. And then later we talked about it, and of course you've written about it. How is this? I guess my question is, one of my questions is, have you? First of all, in the essay, you don't arrive at a conclusion about what's behind that silence, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But in this case, what you just read, of course, the silence is annihilation. What for you is kind of the relationship between silence and narrative and talking and storytelling when it comes to love?
Well, I mean, part of how these books came to be, and it is only part of many other sort of factors that led me to these realizations, was a lot of thinking about, I guess, the relationship of narrative to belief and the action of those two things in marriage. That marriage is a belief state. Many relationships are belief states. Possibly all relationships are belief states. And the story you tell, you narrate yourselves in a relationship, and the story you tell sustains your belief in what it is. I mean, in fact, it is it. Probably that story and your telling of it is
love.
Yeah,
right? Is the love.
Yeah, is the world that you've created for yourself, and obviously the end of marriage is the end of that story. It is the end of, and indeed, worse still, it's the division of that story into two warring versions of what happened. So suddenly, instead of agreeing and together writing the story of your life, you're disagreeing and
It's a new narrative.
Yeah. Well, usually it's two opposing narratives. And so I guess I thought, could that, and you in that state become suddenly other people's narratives, other people's belief structures become much more, well, they cross over the boundary, you become much more exposed to them.
And porous.
They're more palpable. Suddenly you're hearing a lot more because you're not telling. And I guess I thought, how can I create a literary form that enacts that change and that I suppose reveals the nature of the perceiver, the narrator, because a novel generally has to have one of those. Without, how could that be done without stating things by just using silence?
So Faye, your protagonist, had to become silent in order to create this porosity in the other, to hear the other narratives, right? Yeah. It seems to me in both the novels and in your new essays that you are given to, there's a vulnerability that both you and we can assume Faye has to kind of projecting, to assuming that other couples, other marriages, other households are doing it correctly.
Don't we all think that?
Don't we all?
Don't tell me I'm the only one.
Yeah, but what it makes me feel is that that narrative has the power to really damage, to damage us. And it's interesting that you expose Faye across 3 books to stories by others. Is Faye vulnerable to what people tell her?
Well, it's interesting because in the sort of early conceiving of Outline, I absolutely assumed she would have a far more interfering and managerial role, that she would essentially upbraid the people who were speaking to her, because the thing that I was willing to make one of her characteristics is my own total faith in language as a moral system, and to me it is so easy, almost to the point of making life unbearable, to hear when someone is saying something that isn't true, to identify fakeness. And I think everybody can to an extent, and I think I would write about this in one of the essays somewhere, that you go to the cinema and you see a film and you want to believe in it, and it's annoying when the film becomes bad and you can't believe in it anymore. And I think anybody feels that, and that doesn't have to be a particularly complicated film. It's just if it isn't suspending your disbelief. And I guess language for me works the same way.
Can I pause you for a second? You talk about the morality of language a lot, and I just want to, for our sake, I just want to ask you exactly what you mean by the morality of language, if there is an exact kind of.
Well, I mean, it's a complicated question, but for these purposes, I guess I can reduce it. Okay. And indeed, I mean, I've taught creative writing, as you have, and I suppose this would also have been my one blunt instrument that I would use in teaching to whack people over the head with, because it was, to me, the only thing I cared about, people getting wrong. So, language is an interface, and it needs to have objectivity as its aim.
A correspondence to truth.
Yeah, and too much subjectivity, then suddenly you're changing the world according to how you feel about it. You're not representing it as it is, you're changing it. And I guess that's, to me, a moral problem. If your perception interferes with the thing that you're perceiving.
So would you say that Faye does not interfere in these books?
Well, as I say, initially I felt that she would say to people, I don't believe that. I think you changed that detail to make it a better story. I don't believe that actually happened. And but in fact,
which is a traditional novel.
Right? But I gave up on that really quickly and thought actually listening is a rather different. Listening when you're in a state of poverty, of dispossession, is a very different thing. Listening when you're invested in your own account, then there's some war that can be fought between different versions.
So I love this idea of Faye is in a state of poverty, and I wonder if you could clarify. I mean, do you mean that she doesn't have agency?
Well, she's given that up, and she said, I will no longer impose my will. And the question of fate and how things happen, and why they happen, and how much of that is the result of you causing them to happen, and believing that they've happened, and essentially there's a book which I'm sure you've read, a biography of Renoir, the painter, written by his son, and he quotes Renoir as endlessly using this image about himself of being that he's the cork, C-O-R-K, and he just floats along, and wherever the water takes him, that's where he goes, and the cork can't resist being taken along.
It's like Heraclitus, kind of,
So it's sort of that idea that because she feels she has brought disaster on herself and her children, that she doesn't want to act.
Did you? Again, I have three questions. Which one to ask? Did you have when you were writing the books a Greek sense of human matter, affairs? Yeah. And do you still? That we're subject to fate, and that we don't.
I sense this is a Catholic town, but I am actually.
How many Catholics?
I am in fact a qualified Catholic myself, so I think I'm allowed to say that part of the pain of such things as breakdown of marriage is, or I in thinking about it, identified it as and indeed such things generally as guilt and conscience and fear of punishment, and those things seem to come, for me anyway, from the Christian story. And I guess when I began to read Greek drama, it was so amazing to find not light and dark, good and evil, but mixture, which is reality. It's, good and bad completely mixed together. So I found it very liberating that instead of the Holy Family, there were extraordinary families where children were savagely murdering their parents. I mean, that as a moral system, it felt like such a relief. It felt like a sort of permission to think about things in a different way.
And do you think that your choice so for those of you who haven't read the novels, I think one of your innovations, the formal innovations, is that you avoid having Faye, you avoid access, you don't permit us access to her interior. I don't think there is an exception to that. Am I wrong?
Well, occasionally she tells a story of her own. She tells it in very much the same way that everybody else tells it.
So our only access to her thinking is when she speaks. Otherwise, unlike any other, the traditional narrative form, we don't have access to her thinking in an interior point of view. And therefore, there's a lack of processing and explaining on Faye's part, which is another radical departure from any novel that we might read that's not by Rachel Cusk. Do you connect that decision to get rid of that to this movement that you made from the Christian, or from the Hebraic Christian, let's say, the Judeo-Christian framework, to a Greek framework? Because in the Judeo-Christian framework, there is this sense of action and consequence, punishment, intention.
And a division of internal voices, the whole idea of conscience, for instance. So more than one person speaking inside you.
It seems to me that you attach the technique of the book is somehow in line with Greek,
I looked at, I guess what I really looked at was the Odyssey, and that was kind of the sort of the beginning of my thinking of how what kind of shape this enterprise could have, and the telling of stories and the recollection of things, of events afterwards. So that was one part of it. I mean, the point about consciousness, I guess I'd always felt that there was a fundamental misunderstanding in the novel about what is possible in terms of, how form has to an extent, be reflect a possible reality. And so, the idea of writing a novel in which you would reimagine, I don't know, the Second World War when you weren't there, or write about some country you've never been, or I never, it never felt to me that anyone fully explained why they felt entitled to do that. And I suppose I always felt the same thing about thinking that you could imagine the consciousness of another, because it seems to me that the absolute fundamental condition of life is that is not given to us, and that all of the other things that we do, physically, mentally, emotionally, is a brokering of that fact, is an attempt to communicate with each other, to know each other, when in fact we cannot know each other. So, to begin with, that my argument was against the sort of world of point of view of the novels. The novel that's written.
Jamesian.
And there's a chapter. No, not a Jamesian idea, but very much the novel of today, where there's Anne's story, and then the next chapter will be John's. It's the same events related by John, and then and that seemed to me a very wrong direction that the novel was headed in. So
in that sense, you're kind of. It seems to me that your protest. The books. These novels are a form of a certain kind of protest, both against the novel, but is there a sense of protesting reality as well in these books? Because let me explain. Faye, so all these characters say these things to Faye, and some of them are kind of like the one you read are moments of tremendous kind of revelation and personal stories that they tell her. Sometimes they seem to be telling narratives that they seem exaggerations. They seem like the person's lying to themselves. Sometimes they comment on Faye. And Faye she very rarely reacts. And there's a sense that I have, and I wanted to ask you this, is Faye kind of in a state of astonishment at reality and at what people are saying to her? Is she in a,
I think it is more akin to looking in a mirror because you don't know what you will see there. And the initial worry being you will look in the mirror and there will be nothing there. That's where she begins, I think.
She's looking when she's facing others, that's a mirror?
Yeah. I think that's sort of how I would characterize it. That because a lot of the people that she talks to are strangers. They're not people she knows. Occasionally there are people she knows, and they reflect her back. They give away. That's really how you mostly learn things about her. Is that occasionally she meets someone she knows, and they show their knowledge of her, and so you then learn something about her. But
she seems in a state of shock to me.
But she is in a state of shock, and that shock is loss of identity. And really, the books are asking the question in a very winding and roundabout way: what was that identity? Where did it come from? Why did it go away? What was it worth? Was it the true reflection of?
So is it that in order to be married and to have a marriage and a family and kids, that one has to completely have your identity subsumed by the narrative of the family and your partner? And
well, I think it's not just marriage. It's another thing that's never mentioned in the books, and for me, working out that I could write this way was the most. I'm not a person who would sort of run unclothed through fields of corn,
You're not?
No, but it really felt.
That's not what Simon said.
It felt like that. It felt so liberating. I didn't have to talk about where she'd come from, who her parents were, what town she was born in, what she looked like, what her education was, and realizing that, I thought, God, how much of oneself is burdened with, is an explanation of those things. That actually, this moment of loss that she is in at the beginning is a kind of freedom, frightening freedom.
And I think that's, if I were to connect all your work, including the essays, it really is a movement toward the liberation of self. Does that seem accurate to you?
Yeah, I think I describe it in the Coventry essay. I think that as being born imprisoned in a block of stone from which it is, one's obligation to free oneself.
Can I read a very small, just a paragraph from Coventry, because it's related to what you read in Outline. And do we need to explain what Coventry is? Can you quickly just...
So it's an English phrase, to send someone to Coventry, which means to stop speaking to them and to ignore them and pretend that they're not there.
Right, so in the essay, your parents banish you to Coventry.
Yes.
By suddenly, and it's this kind of subtle, it's subtle at first, it sneaks up on you, you realize they haven't called and they won't respond, and suddenly you're in Coventry. And so the essay kind of circles around this and keeps coming back to this state that you're in with your parents. And in the paragraph I'm reading, you also have a friend who is kind of a materialist, and she ends up, if I remember correctly, kind of cleaning. She raised all these children, and at one point throws all of their old toys out and all of everything she's ever kind of bought them. She gets rid of them, and then at a certain point she wishes she could have them back and put them all into one big pile, like in the backyard, I guess. And because she wants to see a physical representation of these objects that once were part of the narrative, that she once believed in when she bought them. Here's the paragraph.
What a question.
We did. You are summoned from the stage.
Accidentally.
You write, much of my being in Coventry, I now realize, lay in my willingness to recognize and accept the state of being outcast. And I'll just, for 1 second, I'll pause there. There's this idea that you are a participant in your own banishment, participant in the narrative. Anyway, let me go on. I suspended my disbelief, and having done so, I jeopardized in some sense my relationship with reality. Like gravity, truth can only be resisted for so long. It waits grayly for the fantasy to wear off. My friend's concern with the material evidence of her family life likewise seems to me to be a concern about truth. It is as though each of the many objects that pass through her home over the years represents a lost fragment of reality. She believed in all of it at the time, believed passionately in the Barbie doll and the violin and the Nintendo that everyone had to have one year. And once the belief had worn off, these things were thrown away. There's this sense that what's like in the piece that you read, that once the narrative stops kind of functioning, that one is actually denuded of not just the relationship, the marriage, the family, but indeed the past. As you were, so aptly said, you realized you didn't need to tell Faye's past, and it's as if we're brought back to that the dissolution of something as important and as structural as a marriage returns us to some kind of ground zero, or we're back in a state of being born again almost.
Which, is, I think one of the conclusions in the Coventry essay is that in fact there is nothing to be afraid of in this place, this Coventry place. The worst has already happened, and there is nothing to be afraid of. And that, I guess, was another of the sort of driving factors in the kind of technique of the trilogy, was this idea of dread as a component of narrative, and so you read a novel or you watch a film, and this thing called suspense is the word given to it. You know that things are being introduced, new elements are being introduced, or a story's being told in order to cause you pain or worry or anxiety or
that there will be a payoff.
Yeah.
At some,
yeah. So it's that, I just thought I want to get off that roller coaster of it's almost like the writer is leading you into various rooms with a blindfold on, and you don't know what's going to be done to you, and so to create a writing that it was completely clear, because there was no narrator, therefore there was going to be no action that you were going to be dragged through, that you did not need to feel that dread.
And I think that's what I was trying to allude to earlier about the kind of Judeo-Christian framework, is that if in a typical novel there's a line of suspense and dread, it kind of mimics this idea that life has an intentionality about it, that experience is shaped with intention, and that there are going to be payoffs. You are going to be punished for certain things. You're going to be rewarded, and again, you freed yourself of that in as we're saying, kind of a Greek way, by saying, no, you indeed are something you're an object or a leaf floating in the river. Okay, well, I think I'd love to hear. Can you read a little bit from one of the essays, several of the essays? I want to kind of veer the conversation toward perhaps family and children and being a woman and an artist and some of those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is an essay I wrote about what it's like, what it is to have a house, a home, and what a complicated thing that is. In fact, I think the person I talk about here is the same friend that I talk about. I don't have that many friends, so I tend to use them, quite often.
Oh dear.
Anyway, I think this is the same friend. So this is talking about, my very unrelaxed idea of, or creation of this idea of home, and sort of other versions of it that I see. Another friend of mine runs her house with admirable laxity, governing her large family by a set of principles that have tidiness as a footnote or a distant goal, something it would be nice to achieve one day, like retirement. In the kitchen, you frequently feel a distinct crunching sensation from the debris underfoot. The stairs are virtually impassable with the possessions that have accumulated there, the books and clothes and toys, the violins and satchels and soccer shoes, all precipitously stacked as if in a vertical lost property office. The children's rooms are so neglected they have acquired a kind of wilderness beauty, like untouched landscapes, where over time the processes of growth and decay have created their own organic forms. In the kitchen, the children make volcano cakes or create chemical explosions. Somewhere in the upper regions of the house, a singing teacher leads the older ones in hollering out show tunes. In the corridors, there is always a multitude of friends and pets and hangers-on milling around. One day, a hamster got out of its cage. It was found 6 months later, living happily with a brood of offspring in a wardrobe. My friend looks at it all with mock despair, then waves it away with her hand. If that's how they want to live, she says, then let them. In this house, the search for happiness appears to be complete, or rather, in the chaotic mountain of jumble, it is always somehow at hand, the easiest of all things to find. The foreground is entirely human here. The rooms may have been neglected, but the people haven't been. It is clear to me that by eradicating the tension of the material, my friend has been able to give her children exactly what she wanted to give them: love, authority, the right advice, where for other people these things got mixed up and snagged on one another. The opposing philosophies of seeming and being, when combined, create a flawed constitution whose rules, if you ever manage to follow them through, ultimately betray an alarming lack of logic at their core. How many times had I found myself pursuing bizarre disciplinary arguments in order to uphold domestic laws that possibly I didn't even believe in? I often seemed to see my children looking half-pityingly at me as I railed at them for breaking something or making a mess. Is an object really more important than a person? Their eyes seem to ask. Is tidiness more important than playing? Is there really no difference between an accident, a mistake, and a calculated act of destruction? Yet for my own mental processes to work, the object world had to stay still. Objects were capable of exerting an extraordinary mute power. Even Virginia Woolf writes in her diary of buying a new chest of drawers and having to leave her writing room every half an hour to go out and look at it. The photograph of the author in his book-lined study represented for me an unattainable ideal, for I would have to be on both sides of the image, creating the stage set and being its principal actor. The artist in me wanted to disdain the material world, while the woman couldn't. In my fantasy of the orderly writer's room, I would have to serve myself, be my own devoted housewife. It would require two identities, two consciousnesses, two sets of minutes and hours. One eye would have to clear the children's toys from the desk so that the other eye could work. The image of the freewheeling mother with her disregard for appearances was somehow threatening from two opposing perspectives, for her apparent inferiority was in fact the reverse. She was superior to the suburban housewife in her miserable prison of immaculate surfaces, and she was superior too, to me, to the modern divided woman, because her indifference to the domestic represented a form of courage. With her crunchy kitchen floor and her whirlwind swept rooms, she was claiming the freedom of a man, or a child, or an artist, at the same time as she was asserting the superiority of her mother love. For in overthrowing the power of objects, she was simultaneously removing them as a last line of defense. Anyone could access her. There was no governed terrain to keep a person out.
Earlier you said about the dissolution, about what we all tend to think of as catastrophe, which is the end of a marriage, and you said there's nothing to worry about.
Well, the worst has already
happened, but
yeah.
and yet, for you, after the worst had already happened, you were a single mother and with two daughters, and you had to struggle to survive, to continue to be an artist. You are the modern artist woman. Can you talk a little bit, I guess, about that position of being, of what the burden is and what the challenges are of you're not her, you're something quite different, and what it was like to try to run a household and set up a household and ignore a household and become who you are.
Well, the thing that would probably be written on my gravestone if I get to choose what is will be, she didn't have enough fun. That is the thing that I feel. I know
we need to change that, right? Yeah. starting after this talk.
I know many women writers who I respect, who have, and indeed, the history of women's writing is full of these people too, who knew that they couldn't do both. And I think I've described that numerous times in essays as the woman basically deserting the feminine zone and moving to a world of male values. So you decamp, you go and live among these male values because you can actually work and be recognised and do what you're meant to be doing there. Yeah. But you sunder your links to your own femininity as an artist, and the consequences of that. The Brontes, Virginia Woolf, but these people suffered madness, early death. They had they didn't get away with it. Pain came to them one way or another. In our world, that isn't true. There is the figure of the woman writer who does not live as the majority of women do, and
but without children.
That's
right?
what I mean. Doesn't live that life.
Yes.
Is a writer, is a woman writer, but doesn't shares with a minority, I suppose, a version of femininity. And for me, it was given, I guess, to live. My work required it to live the ordinary life, I suppose, that was handed out to me, and
you mean your writing required it? Is that what you're saying? Or the circumstances?
I guess so. It never. I never took. If there was an opportunity to actually have a reasoned thought process, which was I'm a writer. I would like to spend my time writing in a dignified fashion, and if I have children, and it will be much harder to do that. I never sort of made that decision, and many of the women writers that I've really loved in a different way, people like Grace Paley or Jane Smiley, they have written about children, about having children from precisely that battle zone. And that indeed is the writing I probably cherish the most. And whether it helps, whether women who are not writers but are readers, whether they in their crunchy kitchens, or clean kitchens, or with their children, or want to read the true reflection of their circumstances, or would rather be transported into some different place where a different reality appears to rule. I don't know, but
it turns out, I don't know if anybody's ever said this to you, but that the work of those writers and yourself end up being very informative is not a good enough word. Add a richness to the male reader as well. And I know, because I have 20 male writer friends and non-writer friends who admire your work for precisely these reasons, and many of them have children and have seen it from the other side, I suppose, or have been in actually, oddly enough, similar circumstances.
Well, I mean, it is what's radical about femininity is possibly not present in the ordinary expressions of femininity, and so there can be a feeling sometimes. And I remember, I wrote a memoir a long time ago about motherhood that, like all of my attempts at that form, caused people to jump up and down and go mad and scream and run around
what
in circles.
is it, especially in your own country?
No, I know. Anyway, there was much jumping up and down and going mad about that, and so it did seem that there was that was a radical location, that there was a way of talking about motherhood that was not allowed, and I guess that's been my mission, my fate has been to go into all of these areas and say what I think about them.
I'm still a little confused about this idea of that this kind of story and storytelling doesn't come out of femininity. Am I misunderstanding what you just said? That
what, my kind?
No, you just said that you said something about that traditional femininity has not allowed these kind of stories to be told, or something like that. Maybe I misheard.
Well, I think what I said was that radical femininity, because being female is still a radical state, because it's still changing. Women haven't evolved to the end. There's still many things that they are not allowed to do or be, or so it remains a radical state. But it's never been clear to me whether well, in fact, maybe that is the explanation for why my writings about the ordinary things, children, and annoys people so much, because I see those as radical conditions.
When I hear you, and I'm sure the audience would agree, when we hear you read, though, for example, the passage you just read, which is about one could say it's about these normal, that the terrain of what you just read is domestic, right? And yet, when I hear you reading that, and when I read you, it seems like it's a new view on those things. It's a different, I haven't seen them before. It doesn't feel, it doesn't feel like it's holding to any sort of traditional idea of being a woman.
No, well, I guess that's the odd. That's the "she hasn't had enough fun" tagline. I suppose that is what I've been given to look at, and so that's what I've engaged with.
Do you think now? And I just have to ask you for myself and for people here. Now that your two daughters, if it's okay for me to say, have transitioned into a different phase in life. Do you see some fun on the horizon?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm still wrestling with in this story of motherhood is, and all sorts of kind of awful naff phrases and truisms about, it being the journey rather than the destination, etc.
Yes. The process,
where you should expend your efforts, you must make sure to sort of enjoy.
Yeah.
I mean, parenthood is the opposite to that, really, in that it can feel like an ordeal and like the greatest threat to your continuing to function and finding any kind of meaning or satisfaction in life. And then suddenly there are these two utterly delightful people, and they say, bye, and they go. And you really miss them. So I haven't quite worked out how, and I suppose that is exactly the same as creativity. It is creativity. You finish, and those things remain part of the environment of your life.
And I think there's a sense, when you finish the trilogy, there's a sense of now what? And I think that's the state you're almost describing now, which is this new condition that is another form of limbo almost.
Yeah, and that's something I feel very much and have a lot of questions about. And I guess my biggest question is, once you have finished the gendered life, the strictly gendered life, does experience become ungendered in some way? And what does that mean? And what would it look like? And finding that we were talking to someone who I believe is in the audience last night about Japanese and it being a gendered language, that women use different words from men, and I find even English to be a very difficult interface or medium in that sense, in that it seems to a bit like what we were talking about Christianity, it's so freighted, it's so burdened with identity, and a lot of the pleasure that I got in writing the trilogy was most of the characters are speaking English as a second language. And I think anything I now write, I will write in global English rather than English.
In email English.
Yeah, well, Google Translate, that kind of thing. I can really imagine.
You're going to type it into Google Translate.
Exactly.
I think this question of whether you can live an ungendered life is absolutely brilliant, and it's a very fascinating question. And I think that the sense of the unknown, that every essay in this book the essays don't wrap up neatly like we think of essays, and nor do your novels. And so they leave us in this kind of state of not knowing and of asking kind of what now. I wonder if we could kind of finish with you reading the other passage about the children, because I think it's very apt to this discussion. Do you have that there?
I do. Oh, okay. So hang on. There's two separate passages.
Yeah, but they're kind of connected.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is about when my daughter was 14 and her friends used to come around. Shall I read? I'll read the paragraph before just because it explains it.
Yeah.
Okay. My younger daughter attends an all-girls school. She is 14 and has countless friends, most of them white-skinned and fair, with declarative middle-class voices and abundant shining waterfalls of hair. They move in shoals around the streets and shops around the park, talking and shrieking and giggling ceaselessly. Their only silences are the dramatic kinds of pauses that occur in the television series they watch, silences that signify the presence somewhere nearby of a narrative event. This event, more often than not, is interpersonal, a plot twist in the politics of their friendship group, a falling out or change of allegiance. But sometimes it takes the form of a misfortune afflicting one of their number, to whom the rest offers support with hours of murmuring discussion. Occasionally the shoal drifts in my direction and settles for an afternoon in my house. When my daughter was smaller and invited friends home, I knew I had to provide a narrative explanation of what the afternoon would hold. I made the world known to them by description, almost as if by describing it I created it, or at least maintained control of the narrative. I am mother, you are children. This is home, tea time, play. Sometimes I couldn't bear the conscription of language to this phrasebook of false cheer and uniformity. At other times it was soothing to be able to communicate in bland sentences that left my thoughts undisturbed. What was clear in either case was that these social rites were a fulcrum of storytelling, a place where a common version of things could be reiterated and agreement reached. The smallest child would know instantly if an adult said something not in the script. They themselves were learning to become scripted, saying please and thank you, answering the questions they were asked. I saw all of us, to a degree, as indoctrinated. In this sphere of universal values, I tried to keep hold of the thread of individuality. Yet despite the irritants of this mass religion, the alternatives were unclear. 6 months later, my younger daughter, I notice, has changed. She has refined her group of friends. There are fewer of them, and the ones that remain are more serious, more distinct. They go to art galleries and lectures together. On Saturdays, they take long walks across London, visiting new areas. My daughter has become politicized. At dinner, she talks about feminism, politics, ethics. My older daughter has already made this transition, and so the two of them join forces, setting the world to rights. When they argue now, it is about the French headscarf ban in schools or the morality of communism. Sometimes it's like having dinner on the set of Crossfire. I become aware of their verbal dexterity, their information, the speed of their thought processes. Sometimes I interject, and more often than not, am shot down. This, in my own teenage years, would not have been tolerated, yet I find it easy to tolerate. They're like a pair of terriers with a stick. They've got their teeth into the world and its ways. Their energy, their passion, their ferocity. I regard these as the proper attributes of youth. Yet inevitably the argument overheats. One of them storms away from the table in tears, and I have to go and talk her into coming back. Strange as it may seem, they are still children, still having to operate bodies and minds that are like new, complex pieces of machinery. And indeed, at the meal's end, it is I who rises and clears the plates, just as I always have. It would be far too easy to jibe at the skin depth of their feminism. Besides, I don't see that anything has fundamentally changed in the contract between me and them. For the first time, I am glad of the flaws in our family life, though at times I have suffered bitterly over them, seeing in other people's impeccable domestic lives a vision of stability and happiness I have absolutely failed to attain. Shall I just finish this paragraph, because otherwise it's a bit sad?
Yeah.
But in this new territory, we perhaps have less to lose. No image is being defiled, no standard of perfection compromised. The traditional complaint about teenagers, that they treat the place like a hotel, has no purchase on me. In fact, I quite like the idea. A hotel is a place where you can come and go autonomously and with dignity. a place where you will not be subjected to criticism, blame or guilt, a place where you can drop your towel on the floor without fear of reprisal, but where hopefully over time you become aware of the person whose job it is to pick it up and instead leave it folded neatly on a chair.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rachel. Do we have time for a few questions?
And we have time.
Okay. Would you be willing to take a few
Yes,
questions?
absolutely, but don't feel you have to ask.
Are there
If
any?
you would like to ask a question, if you raise your hand, we'll try to get a microphone to you. Already a challenge.
Hi, I'm wondering about, well, I love your books, and it's not just what they're about, but it's the language you use and how your sentences are constructed. It's like art, reading your sentences. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk about that a little bit. Is that how you think? Or how do you come up with the way that you write?
Yes, it's not an app. There is no app for this.
Come on, there's an app.
It's a really good idea. Practice, discipline. Writing is technical, completely technical. So, when I first started writing, when I was a teenager, I used to read a page of the dictionary every day, and then try and use the ridiculous words that I had that I didn't even know how to pronounce. So I've always been interested in writing as a technical thing, and it's always interested me how it could, how that in me could connect, as it had to when I taught creative writing, with people who believed that writing would somehow free something bottled up in them. And I would usually begin my writing course by saying, would it free you if I said that in 10 weeks' time you had to sit up on a stage and play Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto on the piano perfectly and you don't know how to play the piano. So to me, that technique was so essential, and the expressive part of it is the little reward, I guess, that comes at the end of it. And studying other writers, that was a big part of it.
First of all, I'd like to say how really thrilling it is that you're here, Rachel. I think I first read of you 3 years ago. There was an interview in the New Yorker written by Penelope Lively, which, given your third trilogy to Egypt, is a nice choice. And then the New York Times was writing articles that seemed to criticize your characterless, plotless writing. And I recall being at a seminar format at UCSB and asking the professors there, is that the way of the future? No characters. Then I took time this week to be reading your work myself. I finally got to it. And in Outline, I saw evidence by page 52 when you're in Clelia's apartment looking at some upper boats that are aerially hung by cords, as she might have, being the owner of the apartment, and then saying it took very little, it required only a couple of steps to move from the impression of wind in the sails to the sight of the mesh of fine cords, a metaphor I felt sure Clelia had intended to illustrate the relationship between illusion and reality, though she didn't expect her guest to go one step further. And I thought, there is a character here. This is not writing without a character. I would like to maintain that you're very clearly giving attributes to Faye across the book, and that as to plot, there were a couple moments, a key one involving a jackknife and blades being flipped, in which you were on the edge of your seat. There was only that one dire one. Are you actually striving for what the critics have said, or do you feel they kind of got it wrong? I'd really like to hear your take on characterless and plotless.
Well, I think that reality is full of interest, and that it sometimes forms itself into stories, and it's like a good photograph when things compose themselves, without you having to set them up, to reveal a lot. I think people behave in ways that are half at the service of what they've been conditioned to be or created as, and half at the service of some nameless thing in themselves, and the operation of that can sometimes be called character, and it changes according to circumstance, and so to me, if those things are plot and character, then yes, my books are full of plot and character. But car chase, no. Great long stories that have significant endings, I think those things are very rare, and the thing that I concern myself with as a writer is the rule and not the exception. So I would never write about something that I had no evidence for, that I hadn't seen in the world around me. But to me, in the world around me, there is a lot of plot and character. That's a sort of cheating answer.
It's a good one.
Hello. One aspect of your writing that I'm completely bowled over by is the sense of being dropped in on a character's life and just immediately being there without any sense of history of that character. And I would just love to know how you do that. What's your process of just taking us there so immediately, shifting, the characters in your novels?
Well, I guess when in the Baroque or Rococo period, people thought a table had to have 8 legs and great elaborate engraved wooden flanges, and then someone worked out that a table, in the sort of most spare bits of modernism, that a table could just be like one thing with a thing on the top and it would still stand up. And I guess that is what I realized writing these books particularly, that I could take away and take away and take away and take away, and still nothing fell over. And that was quite an interesting, exciting feeling, because I realized that I'd found those mechanisms really unsightly and burdensome and boring. It was a boring bit of novel writing, having to sort of explain everything all the time. And I thought, well, I don't need to explain what Paris is, because you've been there. So if I just say it, you'll know what I mean. And I started doing that more and more. You can assume that people have parents. That's everyone has come to this earth by more or less the same process, and we all know what parents are. We know that they're in a range of so you don't need to say it. It can be assumed, just as you assume it when you meet somebody. You don't need to know every single thing about them. You find out about them by a different process. So the more I realized that, the more I found that actually I could dispense with probably half of what was usually in a sentence. So it's more fun.
Well, I want to thank both of you and all of you for your questions and your attentiveness, but especially Andrew, thank you for the questions that you brought that drew Rachel out so beautifully. Rachel, thank you for being so open and real in your responses, and I hope you will join me now in saying to them thank you, and also join all of us outside in this lobby area. Rachel has kindly offered to sign books. She will be just across from our Family Resource Center around the corner here, and there is some wine and nibbles for those of you who are able to stay and talk further of what we have shared this afternoon. So once again,